It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning for what is really a very timely gathering and to be thinking about these issues when we literally have 1 year and 2 weeks before the Article 50 period expires and we formally leave the European Union, transition periods notwithstanding. So this is an urgent discussion that we need to get underway because there are some complex and very big issues on the table, and I hope that between us during the course of today we can start to shed some light on the way forward, perhaps even building some sense of priorities as to where we go next. I don't think it's any secret in the room. Many colleagues and friends here I know were very sceptical about the prospect of Brexit for the quality of the British environment. Two simple reasons for that. Over more than 4 decades, we had, with European Union partners, negotiated world-leading environmental standards on natural habitats, on chemicals, on recycling, a whole raft of different areas. We were very worried that should Britain leave the European Union, those would be in jeopardy. And this was not least because very prominent Leave campaigners said the reason they wanted to get out of the European Union was to get rid of that red tape, including those environmental rules, the implication being that we wanted to push standards down. And that was especially troubling to us because we saw this in the context of another narrative that was there at the time about Britain going onto the global stage to forge new trading arrangements with all sorts of countries. And those of us who've been in the environmental movement for some time have seen the way in which trade negotiations can put downward pressure on national standards in order to open up borders and to be able to create conditions for freer commerce. So these things were very serious concerns to us, and that's why many of us campaigned to remain. But we are where we are now at. And actually, we're in a place that I didn't think we would be in. I think I speak for many in the room in being pleasantly surprised to see the prominence of environmental issues now in the national debate. Many things recently have led us to see a new political interest, not least the Prime Minister personally launching the 25-year environment plan, a very solid piece of work in terms of the aspirations therein. And alongside that, we saw radical new ideas being presented about the future of farm policy in Britain as we leave the EU. That's one area where the environmental community was very concerned about the impact of Brussels rules, was the extent to which the Common Agricultural Policy had been largely responsible for the rapid decline of wildlife in this country over the decades. So that was very welcome as well. We've also seen a recommitment of Britain's leadership on the climate change agenda. Still big questions there about how we will deliver, but nonetheless, it's now back there as something that we're evidently more committed to publicly. Air pollution has been on the agenda, and of course there's been much attention to plastics. All of these things and others have thrust environmental issues up the national agenda, and this is something hopefully that we can now build on in this period before we leave the European Union to come up with some platforms that can help us to not only be a global country in terms of our economic ambition, but also one in terms of the environment. And I think most of us now who've been thinking about this and talking with one another, we can see very clearly the need for a new platform to bring all of these aspirations together that we've been hearing about, including the 25-year plan, and to enshrine that in legislation. We would like a new Environment Act to lay out how this country is now going to go forward. Because those threats that I talked about before in terms of what might happen with European Union rules once we're out, what might happen in terms of our ambition to trade, these things will still be threats. So we need legislation now to set the direction, to set the ambition, to set the frameworks for the future. And we've done this before on climate change. The Climate Change Act is a very good example of what can be done in setting out a long-term view and then putting in place the policies to be able to meet that long-term ambition. But why would politicians, why would any party wish to take forward this kind of world-leading environmental ambition in law? What's the point of doing that? Well, one thing, of course, is the growing body of science. We know that our world is very rapidly changing. We know that we are on the brink of a 6th extinction of wildlife. Plants and animals disappearing at a rate unprecedented since the time of the dinosaurs. Literally, that is what is going on right now. We know that we have incredible pressure on natural resources, from fresh water to soils to fish. And all of these things have implications. We've moved into a new era, and in this country, not least because of the work of the Natural Capital Committee, we've moved beyond the idea that looking after the environment is a nice to have into a place where we can now see it's essential for our health, wealth and security. We can't continue to degrade our ecosystem and expect to thrive in a social or economic sense. We have to stop that, and actually what we have to do now is to reverse it. And we need an act of Parliament to begin that process of reversing these environmental trends. It can be done, and we have plenty of good examples from around the country of people who are doing this already, and many of them are in the room today. I hope going to inspire us in terms of being able to show through practical example what is possible. So we have the science, and we have this changing realization that we need nature. It's not a nice to have. And then, of course, we see now a changing narrative on the back of this amongst leading businesses. Years ago, it was very easy for politicians to stand up and say, well, we've got to cut the green tape in order to foster competitiveness, economic growth and job creation. That's no longer the case. Many companies around the world, many of them based here, can see that their future profitability is based upon healthy natural systems. And they want our country to act not only here, but also on the global stage to be able to project a positive influence across the world in terms of how we can marry economic and social and environmental priorities together. There are many examples of why that's necessary, not least in relation to water supply. Our food in this country not only depends upon it raining here, but also across the many geographies from which we import commodities. So we need to be projecting positive influence outside the UK and doing that not only on the strength of environmental and scientific arguments, but also economic ones. And there are many people in the private sector who now see that. So the narrative has changed there as well. And so then you look at the politics of the UK right now and the divisions that were left behind after the referendum. And I think one thing that it's safe to say, despite all of the arguments that went on, is that nobody really voted for a worse environment, whether left, right, leave, remain, whatever political persuasion, people didn't vote for a further degradation of the environment in this country. So we have the scientific reasons, we have the economic justification, we have the practical examples, and we have the political context, I think, that leaves us in a very good position to step forward as a leader. And actually, if you look at the global position right now, if there's one thing the world needs as we go into the next decades of the 21st century on these environmental questions, it is leadership. We are heading for a potential ecological disaster, and it's going to require some countries to step up and show that it is possible to meet the needs of the electorate at the same time as fostering market economics in ways that deliver for the people, blended with good regulation, and in a way that actually can start to bend the curve on some of these big issues. And actually, let's go back to the question of climate change. We had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and the reason that was possible to be able to forge was because countries could see that it was actually possible to cut emissions and to do that whilst meeting the needs of business and people. And actually, one of the countries that was there at the forefront of all of that was the United Kingdom, with an act of Parliament that it put in place without the European Union. Let's do that now. Let's have an act for nature, for the recovery of ecosystems, for the protection of our common future, and let's go boldly into this idea of global Britain, not only with an economic vision, but also an ecological one. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry. Yeah. I was going to introduce the Secretary of State for the Environment, but I can't see him. Is he here?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
He's a very clever man, Mike, and not a brilliant timekeeper.
Right.
Would you be happy?
I'll just carry on all day if you like.
But I sensed you were cutting it short. Maybe if there are some questions, and
yes,
or and if I kick you off, I mean, Michael, I don't know what he's going to say. What would you most hope to hear from him when he does eventually turn up and talk?
Well, I would hope that the Secretary of State would be bold in setting out the vision he has for delivery on some of the things that he's been talking about, because some of the things I said today in terms of the environmental picture, he's been pretty much on the same page, and we've been pleasantly surprised, many of us, as to the kind of narrative that he's been unpacking. But how now do we turn this into delivery? Because the difference between some very encouraging announcements and non-binding plans and the actual recovery of a wildlife population and the actual improvement of air and river water quality and soil health, there's a big difference between the two. So how we close that gap, I think, is the most important subject for today. But I'm very happy to take any other questions. The lady there. Oh, there we have a microphone there.
How do you marry your views on those needs that you kindly set out with the needs of the farming community specifically?
So this is one area where I think we've seen a radical change of direction from the Secretary of State, and one that's been very welcome for those of us who've been looking at the interaction between farm policy and environmental trends over the years. And what he's now looking to do is to use the system of farming support that we've had, historically being governed by the EU, and to turn that into something which is much more aligned with sustainable agriculture. And so, you know, I think this would be a much more comfortable place for agriculture to be, where the public, via subsidies and other support mechanisms, are helping the farmers to do things that are more evidently in the wider public good, rather than simply being linked to the amount of land that people happen to control. So I do think this is very positive, and hopefully a way of building a much more understanding and a positive relationship between people who eat food and the people who are producing it. Gentleman here, is there? The microphone. There's one right there. I thought Michael had a reputation for punctuality, actually.
John Q from Interface and Service Against Sewage. What spirit would you want business and NGOs to take in relation to a green Brexit?
What spirit should we take in relation to a green Brexit? Well, I think one of the things that has encouraged me over recent years is how there's been a much more joined up discussion between businesses and NGOs about the kind of response we need to make to the unfolding science that we have. And just to over-characterize it in some ways, it is kind of going from CSR, corporate social responsibility, into what you might call the business case. And so, for example, some of the companies that I've been interacting with over recent years, so there's the two sectors which are really able to show the connection between the business case and the environmental agenda beyond CSR is water and food. And so in this country, you see now quite a lot of the major water companies investing in the quality of the environment as a way of getting water to consumers more cost effectively. So, for example, Wessex Water, I know, has been investing in helping farmers to use fewer nitrates and phosphates in order to protect river water quality in a way which actually has taken financial burden away from the company. So the business case is very clear right there. South West Water, again, in a position of restoring ecosystems in order to be able to secure cleaner water more cost effectively. And in the food sector, you see companies beginning to understand that, you know, for example, there is a connection between rainforests and rain. And one area I've looked at quite a lot lately, you see, you know, droughts in West Africa being linked to deforestation, affecting that region's most valuable export, namely cocoa, which is in the products of Cadbury's, Nestle, Mars, and all the others. A direct connection between ecosystem quality and product availability. And that narrative is beginning to build, and I think that's very encouraging. And we see now that the Secretary of State for the Environment has arrived. You're very welcome. Good morning. Should we welcome the Secretary of State?